And in politics, EFF leader Julius Malema has urged his party members to be incorruptible and united. Malema delivered a keynote address at the party's Provincial General Assembly in Benoni ahead of the EFF's third National People's Assembly this December. He says there were challenges amongst members after not forming part of the government of national unity with the ANC. Malema emphasized that former members turned their backs on the EFF for what he describes as personal interests.
The ideological infiltration that confronts us is so sinister because it has the ability to utilize revolutionary language to justify compromise, betrayal, and collaboration. It is those who were most skilled amongst us in ideological language and rhetoric who have used the very same ideological tools of analysis to perpetuate and justify the betrayal of our people and our values as an organization. We have praised them, awarded them with titles, and sacrificed the task of political and ideological development of our movement to their hands. And they have used our trust as a weapon to strike against the very foundations for who we are. Commissars, infiltration in the EFF did not start when a few high-ranking members resigned from the EFF, but it began when certain individuals began to think of themselves as the custodians of thinking in our movement. And unfortunately, we allowed it. The ideological infiltration of the EFF began when we allowed our struggle for liberation to be individualized. And it is that process that allowed ambition to thrive and ideological principle to die. The consequences of this long process of ideological infiltration started showing themselves when there were attempts to convince us to collaborate with the historical enemy at the highest level of governance.
Meanwhile, EFF leader Julius Malema addressed the Provincial General Assembly in Benoni, Gauteng, ahead of the party's third National People's Assembly taking place this December. We now speak to Kenny Mapanga, SABC News reporter. Kenny, you've covered the EFF for a while. You know Julius Malema. You're familiar with Julius Malema's demeanor, his tone, and his general energy in addressing these sort of political events. Has it shifted in the last month or two following the departure of a number of senior EFF members?
Well, good afternoon to you, Oliver, and to the viewers at home. I think we are looking at a different image of Julius Malema as they head closer to that National Provincial Assembly, or People's Assembly rather, and they're heading in there with quite a weakened structure nationally, as you've seen the recent spate of the high-ranking members that have left the EFF. We're told there's still a few more that we could expect to see leaving the EFF. Some may be waiting until the NPA sits and are waiting the outcomes of that before they make a decision on their futures with the EFF. But of course, these gatherings that you're seeing now across different provinces in the country are these structures preparing for this particular NPA that's going to take place in December at the NPA. They'll be discussing a number of issues, including some major issues that may have cost them a lot during the 2024 national and provincial elections. But of course, his main speech is never really touching on those issues in detail, but rather dealing with the reality that the EFF is facing right now as it heads to its electoral conference, essentially, in such a critical state. Of course, he's spoken about the need to guard against infiltration in the EFF, as well as the need to guard against individualism because of how it builds egos and how you centralize figures instead of the needs of the party. It's quite obvious that he is referencing the recent calls for the EFF's Mbuyiseni Dlozi to take up that empty vacant seat of his deputy president at that next NPA that is expected to sit. And he's of course spoken about infiltration rather in the EFF, and has spoken about his previous deputy Floyd Shivambu and how the events unfolded in KZN and how they could have possibly gotten the outcome that they got in KZN, because remember in the previous elections they did quite well in the KwaZulu-Natal province, and that all was shattered with the entry of the MK party in the KwaZulu-Natal electoral outcome. So we can listen to this clip where he highlights this issue, where he refers to, quite obviously, Mr. Floyd Shivambu. Let's take a listen to that clip.
That we as the leadership made a similar diagnosis of an aloof leadership style and character in KZN after the manifesto launch of the EFF, which was held in Moses Mabhida on the 11th of February 2024. We cautioned the then established Central Election Task Force that there is a degeneration in activism and organizational presence by the EFF in KZN. Despite the fact that all reports in terms of election machinery told us a perfect story, the deployees to KwaZulu-Natal during this period was completely divorced from the situation in KwaZulu-Natal. And this was possibly due to factors such as preoccupation with personal career objectives, and that instead of being a revolutionary, that was in touch with reality. There was a creation of a machinery for the purpose of compliance. The same way Christian warned the ANC of a decline of a revolutionary leadership at the height of the armed struggle, we warned the EFF of the decline of the revolutionary and activist leadership in KwaZulu-Natal months before the elections. As an intervention, we even went as far as carefully framing the removal of the head of this organizational DJ from KwaZulu-Natal and saying that he will be supported by Secretary General while redeploying him to the Eastern Cape, where organizational work had already been consolidated. Yes. These are the length we went to protect the dignity of someone who goes around today claiming that he was ill-treated in the EFF. This is what we did for someone who today calls us gangsters. The orchestrated organizational decay in KZN before election constitutes a clear example of infiltration. We are even being kind by saying that the person who was deployed to KZN for election was divorced from reality in KZN. It may even be true and more worrying that he was aware of the damage to come in KZN and kept quiet because he had already chosen to betray this movement.
About his there, placing the KZN's performance for the EFF in the 2024 May polls essentially in the hands of Floyd Shivambu, stating that he probably was involved with personal interests and not the interests of the movement when deployed to that particular province. And we know that ahead of the May polls, he was deployed, and of course there was a change in just before the elections, but that was the central figure being referred to when he gave out that subliminal in his main address to the Provincial Assembly.
Yeah. Part of the criticism around KZN that the EFF has received was Julius Malema's decision to issue a party declarator that those who are unable to fill up a bus and get their constituencies to the stadium will be removed from positions of leadership, and that had quite a big fallout in KZN in particular. How much of that seems to be reverberate amongst its ground forces today as they criticize Julius Malema's leadership?
Well, it's undeniable what the entry of the MK party being led by former President Jacob Zuma, and we know what the kind of figure he is in KZN, had done to change that landscape in that particular province and how people voted in the 2024 May polls. I'm sure it didn't assist when the ground forces that had laid the foundation for the party in that particular province were let go from that province right before the elections, and then you send an individual who's not quite directly connected to that particular province and may not understand that political climate to go in there and do that last bit of bidding ahead of the May polls. I could have added to what the poor electoral outcome was in KZN for a lot of political parties, not just the EFF, but of course it's undeniable that the president, or the presence rather, of the former president in the MK party and their contestation in the KZN was largely influenced by the following that the former president enjoys in that particular province. Yeah,
campaigning for the elective conference in the EFF is not allowed.
Not allowed.
But has anyone surreptitiously raised their hand other than the name of Mbuyiseni being circulated around?
Well, he didn't raise his hand for this NPA. We are seeing that some prospective delegates, if we could call them that, because we know some that have raised their hands, or some that raised his hand rather, have already been moved out of the way. So we know that that figure has been raised around ahead of that NPA, and people have been talking about who will take that second spot and who may be one that EFF leader Julius Malema may favor, versus some other branches are calling for MP Mbuyiseni Dlozi to raise his hand. Of course, we haven't heard from him himself if that is going to be a reality at the NPA, but we see in the speech that he's clearly guarding against this kind of individualism in the political party ahead of that NPA, and trying to guard against that kind of infiltration to ensure a seamless People's Assembly when they head to Nasrec in December.
Yeah, Mapanga, thank you so much for this report. Really do appreciate it.